Welcome to Command Control Power, a weekly podcast hosted by 3 certified members of the Apple Consultants Network, drawing from nearly half a century of combined experience. We talk shop, interview vendors and colleagues, and share what we've learned while operating our technology consulting practices. This is Joe Saponare of CyMac, and my 2 co-hosts are Jerry Zigmont of MacWorks and Sam Valencia of the HCS Technology Group. We also offer a weekly email newsletter which includes show notes for each episode. Learn more at commandcontrolpower.com. And thanks for listening. This episode of Command Control Power is brought to you commercial-free and is made possible by our Patreon sponsors. You can help bring more commercial-free episodes by going to patreon.com/CMDCTRLPWR and supporting the show with a monthly pledge. Thank you for your support of Command Control Power.
So it's always a disappointment when I can't make a show. And the good thing is I listen to the show to do the notes, so I get to hear what you guys talked about. It was a great episode talking about Green Acres. The way you threw in the little Green Acres theme song had me cracking up on this side, I got to say.
I love it.
Yeah, it was awesome. It's nice to be a listener. It's awesome to kind of listen to you guys talk about stuff and be off the show, to be honest. But I did want to ask you as a follow-up.
Sam,
you had this, yeah.
Maybe you should support us on Patreon.
I'll be a no-name sponsor. But I did want to ask you, Jerry, with all this move going on and transferring MacWorks World headquarters and all that stuff, how's it going in the new place?
Oh, man, I don't know. From a move standpoint, we still have lots and lots of things in boxes. For instance, I can't find the charger to the electric drill. So the electric drill died about 3 or 4 days ago, and it's just like sitting on a windowsill somewhere in somebody's room. It's a gigantic house compared to what we were in before. I mentioned that on the show. This is 3 floors. There's just crap all over the place. But on the bright side, it's lovely. It's bucolic. My whole technology setup is still in a box. I got a guy coming over tomorrow who's going to do a little bit of wiring and a little bit of cleanup for me because I just don't have the day-to-day chops for that. It would probably take him a couple hours and it would take me a couple days at least. So I got that happening, and hopefully my technology will be back on board. But I did want to say they're not a sponsor of the show. I can't tell you how amazing the Aero Pro product is, and Aero Wi-Fi mesh in general. I took 2 Pros. One's acting as my router. That's on the first floor. I got another Aero Pro on the 3rd floor, where I'm broadcasting from right now. And I've got a beacon on the 2nd floor. So that's great because all the family sleeps on the 2nd floor. And the beacon has this nice little feature where it throws off a nightlight if you want to turn it on. So we got this nice little hall nightlight. This is an old house. It's got plaster walls. It's not mesh lath, where it's not wire mesh lath. It's wood lath in the walls. It's amazing. We've got Wi-Fi everywhere. And I had a whole Unify Ubiquity, and I still love that product. I had that whole setup going on in the old house. And it was a lot smaller, and I was probably getting a lot of co-channel interference. Everywhere you'd look, there'd be like a Unify access point underneath a couch or something like that. Everybody was radiated with Wi-Fi. It
was in the kitchen cabinets and everything.
Exactly. I can't tell you how fantastic this Aero product is. You just plug it in, and you just got Wi-Fi no matter where you are, and it's fast. It's amazing.
That's a big thing that I've heard a lot about. And you say Aero, I say Eero, whatever. The whole mesh side of things, I've started to open my mind to it because I'm always like, oh yeah, Ubiquity Unify all the way. But not every house can take new wiring or finding the right spot for them. So that's good to hear you say this because I really don't have a lot of experience in that arena. If I have to go with mesh, I'm going to go based on someone I trust.
It makes you look so good as a tech, especially if you're going for that big client with the multi-floor dwellings, these big premises. I know you guys, in your fancy pants area there in Connecticut, you got a lot of those kinds of clients. It's just a win. It's just a no-brainer win for you. It just makes you look like a hero. Be a hero with the Aero.
Nice.
I thought it was Aero. Wait, you keep changing
Aero.
it.
Be a hero with an arrow.
Nice. And I suppose you're going to say they can use that no charge, right?
No charge. I'm just an idea guy here. They just flow out of me.
And take that and run with it. Nice. Well, I'll just take this opportunity to mention another big company that we have talked about many times over the years on this show. By the way, Jerry, I'm so glad that your move process has been going smoothly, I should just say as well, because it's a big deal. It's not easy to move house. And so it's nice to hear you've, basically gotten settled in for the most part, and you're up and running in the new Green Acres location there. for not only the MacWorks headquarters, but also your family. So
thank you. One last thing. I had to laugh at one of the comments. I was texting you guys, through the week. We moved on 2 of the hottest days in Connecticut. At one point midweek, I think I texted you and Sam. I said, I've stopped running completely and I'm drinking beer every day. Sam texted back, that sounds healthy. Busted out laughing when I read that because it was so true. It's just like, I feel like my level of fitness has dropped to 0.
It's nice. It didn't show. I got to see you on FaceTime. I think it was last week or a few days ago or something. And I guess you had a little more than a 5 o'clock shadow going, but you didn't look any worse for the wear other than that. So I guess, I don't know, something about the beer and lack of running is agreeing with you, Jerry. I think you should keep at it.
Yeah, that's a good prescription for somebody my age. Yeah. Drink more, exercise less.
Nice. It also reminds me of our group thread where you I texted us one day, should I wait or should I head home? And Sam's like, I think you should head home. And I said, pick up a 6-pack on the way. So that was a good goof. I love it. Too much.
You guys are
too much fun.
Thank you.
Whether we're supposed to be or not, I guess. So it's fun to hear about how some of the products we talk about for the years on the show actually work for us individually in practice. And one of those you mentioned was Aero. And of course, I'm going to mention Synology. We've been going all in on Synology as a replacement for Mac OS X Server. We're not the first to implement this. I think our colleagues have been doing this for many years now. Now that we've been having more of these machines either in need of replacement due to failing drives and whatever else in the Mac Mini or in the a need for upgrading storage and so on, we're beginning to spec out more and more Synology units. I was in a client location a couple weeks ago, and they were picking my brain about Synology, and I provided them some basic info about how it could work as a replacement to their Mac Mini and Drobo-based solution, which we did not recommend. They were really impressed with it as a much simpler alternative because it's basically all-in-one. The Synology is the server and contains the hard drives. So it kind of was impressive to them, the idea of a network-attached storage device. And we got into a little bit of just general recommendations, gave them some basic guidelines about how, depending on how much storage they needed, they could go with SSDs as a way to get really fast storage and really, in theory, reliable over the long term. And of course, if you need more storage, that gets pretty cost prohibitive and you want to use hard drives, as everyone would expect. But they were really interested in the SSD option, and SSDs have come down in price quite a bit. They were interested in somewhere on the order of 4 terabytes of storage. So we would do that with 4 2-terabyte SSDs, which in a RAID 6 scenario, which is the minimum we'd recommend, would format to 4 terabytes usable capacity. Now, Synology calls that RAID level SHR2. So basically, it's the Synology hybrid RAID format level 2, for 2 levels of redundancy, which means you could have up to 2 of those 4 drives fail without losing any data. So it's like, again, equivalent to RAID 6. Do you guys typically recommend RAID 6 as pretty much the go-to these days, or what do you think about that?
Some of it depends on budget, I think, but you want to talk about redundancy and making sure that they know there's a possibility that more than one drive can die. And if that happens, are you prepared to be down for as long as it takes to fix it? I mean, we make the recommendation based on what we think. And I think that's the way to go, to be honest. And I'll agree with you there. But there have been situations where we haven't done 2 hot swappables and we've gone down to 1 just based on like a smallish client. They don't have a big budget and we can still go down to 1 drive being down.
Interesting. Curious to get your take on it too, Jerry. But in response to that, Sam, I would say that it's not only a question of do they have the budget, but it's like also, do I have the budget in stress level when that happens? Like, am I willing to risk that? I mean, even with all the proper disclaimers and everything, there's just still the fundamental, like when they get in touch in a pinch where they had a drive fail and we didn't know, we weren't monitoring the monitoring, or, there's no ongoing contract or something to monitor it for them. And they didn't let us know that one drive has been blinking and the whole thing's beeping and whatever, and then the second drive fails. Are we prepared to receive that call and bail them out, even with proper backups and stuff? It just could be stressful. So yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, but Jerry, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a little dicier if you're using something like a Promise. I think a Promise, fault tolerance wise, I would probably want to go RAID 6. But I think with some of the built-in disk checking, error checking that Synology has, and the fact if you set yourself up to receive notifications when things start to go sideways, could probably play it a little bit closer to the bone and just go with RAID 5. I've never been in a situation, I mean, never say never, but I don't think I've seen in 13 years of doing this that perfect storm where two drives can see the scenario that you're talking about, Joe, where one drive has failed and then there's another drive that's actually all of a sudden fails because you weren't notified of the first one. But I think, as long as you set up notifications on the Synology, I would imagine you could probably go RAID 5.
Well, also, I'll just jump in with one more thing. I mean, if you're talking going SSDs, the failure rate is going to be lower on that too.
Right. And also the cost is higher. And so, I mean, yeah, that plays into the equation. I feel like this is, I don't know if this is like the engineer or the like wannabe engineer in me trying to over-spec something for my own peace of mind because it's sort of like got my name on it, so to speak. There's this concept like in engineering where, once you actually go through that level of schooling and you have your like engineering license of whatever sort, you're designing a bridge, right? And it's supposed to hold, X number of cars per day for X number of years. Probably some rule of thumb where you would over-spec it to some degree so that, it can not only meet that spec, but it can probably, it's a little bit over-spec'd just in case. That's because you literally like put your name on the thing. You're not going to hide behind like an engineering team. It's you as like the lead engineer who did it. And I'm not calling myself an engineer here by any stretch, but I think there's a certain mindset where like if I'm the one that signed off on this thing and I said you should get the following hardware and you should let us configure it to our specifications, I don't want that to ever fail in a way where a client's going to be in the lurch, even if they're like, well, can you do it for cheaper? I mean, sure, in that case I could be talked into it probably, but I really resist sort of leading with that kind of thing. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's also because it's like better safe than sorry. That's just a good general policy. If I don't know any better, if it hasn't been proven to me that, RAID 5 is going to be fine, I'm going to err on the side of RAID 6. It just seems like best practice. Where I keep going back to is something on an old Apple mailing list way back in the day. One of the wise consultants who were some of the elders on the list said something like, based on the size of modern drives, when you look at the possibility of a drive failing and needing to replace that failed drive and then allow the system to rebuild, there's a certain amount of exposure time during which it's like rebuilding when it's reading all the data from all the other drives that, you're vulnerable to a second drive failing and potentially therefore losing data. And I'm not sure what kind of math equations they used and hand waving that they used to convince me, but I basically felt like I was convinced that RAID 6 is the minimum viable solution these days. But I feel like I'm an outlier now talking to you guys that actually there's still a pretty big role for RAID 5. So I might have to rethink this.
Hey, I'm not against it, man. I mean, I would prefer that if we can do it because of what we're talking about here. But I just don't discount RAID 5. I think by saying this, I'll probably get beat up on Slack. I think where you're going with that makes a lot of sense. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying I do have some RAID 5 installations. The word elders, I love, by the way, only because it reminds me of the IT crowd when they talk about the elders of the internet. But I'll have to talk to Jerry about that because that's probably a reference you won't get.
One more thing to consider, too.
Yeah,
cloud
exactly.
backup is a lot more popular these days, cloud backup. And that's built right into Synology, so you could back up to something like the Backblaze B2. It all depends on what your risk tolerance is. Let's say you did have that perfect storm and you did have RAID 5 and another drive fails. You've got your B2 backup. So if the client can afford a couple days down while you get it from the backup, cloud backup, I think you're okay. It's not, in other words, it's not a risky setup to only go RAID 6. If you decided to go RAID 5 and cover yourself with a B2 backup, I think you're safe too.
Jerry, who's going to back up the backup?
Well, that's Joe's new business. Monitor the monitoring and back up the backup. That's his new business.
That's right.
The whole premise of the rest of this sort of story of discussing speccing out a Synology is sort of predicated on the fact that I would always recommend RAID 6, almost without exception. But I had some really good follow-up questions from this client or potential client who asked me some questions about my recommendation. So they said, okay, you mentioned SSDs, and we like the idea of the speed of the SSDs and so on, but they looked into it and they found that in addition to the RAID 6 equivalent of SHR2, there was another RAID level that Synology has called F1. Have you guys ever encountered that? I have to just admit, I hadn't ever even looked into this.
I haven't used it.
So here's my opportunity to say F1, F2, whatever it takes, Joe.
I love it. So F1, F2, whatever it takes, I agree. I mean, let's, F3 if available, right? But the thing I was actually interested to learn is that there is no F2 or higher. There's just F1. So F1 is a Synology RAID format specifically for dealing with SSDs. And the reason it was created, I guess, because with SSDs, at least in the early days, and I'm not sure how relevant this is now, they suffered from wear leveling issues where as blocks are basically written, erased, and then rewritten, they can wear out depending on like the usage patterns of the SSD, therefore of the server itself, the types of files you're storing, the number of users accessing it, the size of files, things like that. An SSD used in a RAID could wear out sort of prematurely because it's being constantly like erased and then data rewritten to it. Synology, I guess, developed this RAID format called F1, not to avoid wearing out the SSD, but oddly enough, in order to plan for deliberately wearing out one SSD more quickly than the others. Because, I mean, it sounds crazy, but in a RAID, when you have a RAID comprised of SSDs, the real risk is that if they all have basically the same characteristics and the same predictable timeline for wearing out, if you're just wearing them all evenly, they could all fail basically at the same time, and you could just like catastrophically lose data all at once. So it's kind of interesting researching this, that it's designed to mitigate this expected like wearing out of SSDs, but simply by tipping the scales of usage to like favor one of the drives so that it will wear out most likely before the other ones do, so that you will then replace that drive. The redundancy will be rebuilt on the new SSD, and then like the next one will wear out. In researching that, I thought, well, this doesn't exactly give me the warm and fuzzies, to use one of Sam's terms, that we're deliberately wearing out an SSD like more quickly. Because what if one of them is out of spec and wears out more quickly than the others, and they happen to then you could just lose two at one time. The problem is that it only allows for one level of redundancy based on the nature of how that's designed. So I sort of consider that a non-starter, except here's the advice I gave the client. It would be really easy for me to recommend F1 as the RAID format because Synology designs it for SSDs. I can just basically take a page out of their playbook and say, yeah, that's what the recommendation is. But in researching it myself, and finding that the issue of wear leveling is not as significant these days anymore, and for the benefits of having two levels of redundancy in the SHR2 RAID format, I would be leaning more toward using SHR2 and, of course, having good backups. But just wanted to kind of get your take on that and throw it out there also to the collective to see if anybody else has researched this and come up with the same or different answer.
So when the client presented to you this F1 and you actually said to him, geez, I hadn't heard of that, how did you cover for that? I'm just wondering how you handle that delicate situation.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, luckily it came through by email. So the beginning of my email is, hey, Jim, I appreciate these sorts of nuanced and challenging questions. That's my way I addressed it. So I then, of course, proceeded to research it, do my own research to inform myself about it. And then I laid this all out to him based on that research, just as I described to you today. But I didn't let on that this was the first time I had encountered it. I did say to him, I don't have enough experience personally or professionally with SSDs in RAIDs to really definitively answer this question, based on my own personal experience. I do have some anecdotal experience. I have at least I think one client that I can think of that has an SSD based RAID. That's fine, but that's only been for a short time. And I personally have a 4-drive, 1 terabyte SSD RAID, and it's RAID 5 that has been, quote unquote, fine. Maybe it's going to just die. It's been several years. I think it's been about maybe 3 years, maybe a little longer. But like it could be fine, and then all of a sudden it just dies and I lose all my data, based on the problem that this RAID level is supposed to address. So again, I can't really say like, I can speak to this intelligently. I just did the research and I thought, well, I'd still go with my instinct on going with the equivalent to RAID 6.
You want to test it, obviously, but you got to go with your experience level there. It is difficult if a client brings up something that you have no experience in, which happens to all of us. Thankfully, it happened via email, like you said. Sometimes some of the clients research this stuff and they have no idea what they're talking about when they email you about something they found online. But then every once in a while, some guy like this says, hey, what about this? And you're like, oh, crap. I think all of us could use some experience on the RAID with SSDs. I've been using the Iron Wolves for a while based on Jerry's recommendation a while back, and I'm still using them in all my Synologies.
My other thought, too, was that the F1 naming scheme there, I originally thought it was like we'll just use one drive. I thought that it could be that.
That's actually a great point. It's like F1 drive, like just save the rest.
I didn't mean to derail the conversation. I'm so sorry, but I had to.
No, that's a great observation. I mean, because where does that name come from? It's kind of like, hey, we've got a problem here, guys. SSDs all tend to wear out at the same time. What do we do? It's like, I got an idea. We'll design a new level of RAID, F1. Like F1 SSD and save the others. Yeah, it's good.
It just occurred to me, actually, while you were talking, Joe, that I have a recent Synology failure story, and it deals with Backblaze B2 as well. We have a client in Manhattan, and they have another office in Boston that we actually don't manage. We hired another contractor up there to work with them. They had a catastrophic failure on their Synology. They reached out to us because we manage the cloud backups. Even though they're different offices, we manage that centrally for all the offices. So they reached out to us. They said, hey, we need data restored, blah, blah, blah. And how did this happen? And thankfully, we don't manage it, so we don't have to answer those questions. What had ended up having to have happened is we had to restore data from Backblaze B2, and that was – any cloud-based restoration is going to take a while, but they needed significant data in a short amount of time. And it was a long time to get gigs and gigs of data to get it to process and then download and make it available to them. You talking about 1 versus 2 drives and failure rates and how much downtime they could expect. They had at least 24 hours where their critical data wasn't available to them. Because in addition to all this, they didn't have a local backup. This was just a big mess waiting to happen, basically. And I'll get to the resolution of the story, too, because it ended up working out for us. But I also started to think we should start exploring the option of having secondary Synologies on site. I don't know if you guys have thought about that, too, but basically for maximum uptime, to have 2 Synologies, so if that you do have a failure on one that can't be recovered, you can go to the other Synology. Because that's what happened here. What actually happened is we didn't have drive failures. The actual logic board failed on the Synology and just went completely dead. So there was nothing to do with the drives. It just crapped the bed. You know what I mean?
Wow.
I talked to this client. I'm like, listen, guys, if you don't want this to happen again, we would suggest putting in a second Synology per location.
If the client was budget conscious, and it sounds like your client may not be, why wouldn't you just use something like Amazon or B&H as your warehouse, your immediate availability warehouse, and just pick it up in Manhattan or get it next day morning delivery via Amazon or something like that?
No, certainly. I think that's an option too. I'm just talking about you're talking about maximum uptime. If you have them syncing data, you could revert over to the other one pretty quickly and not have to – I'm not in Boston. You know what I mean? Obviously, that would be a convenience for me as well to not have to scramble. But that's what we did, by the way, Jerry. We had something overnighted after the second day of having to restore massive amounts of data because that was their only option at the time. We overnighted a new Synology. And what was interesting is they had a Synology 400 series, and we had recommended a 900 series replacement. And we confirmed with Synology that we could get that upgraded model. We just popped in the drives, and within a few moments spun it back up with all the data accessible again. So I didn't know if a different model would be able to accept the drives, but it did, which was a great surprise for us.
As long as the disk station manager is not older than the one you had the failure on.
No, I agree. I mean, there are certain factors, not like you could just pick up a rack station if you had a DS model or something like that, you know. It was a nice, handy thing to be able to recover that quickly because of that.
Sure.
In the end, though, we ended up, I think, winning here because after that failure and them realizing that this other company wasn't managing them well, they now want us to manage all three of their offices because they have an office in Philadelphia, too, with all managed services. So I was like, well, sweet. I'm glad that Synology died on you because – but, you know, in actuality, though, if you think about it, because, you know, we send out the email alerts and everything, but we never would have gotten anything to say that motherboard was going to fry on them. Like we could get drive failure alerts, but that just came out of nowhere. That wouldn't be an alert that we would see.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's nothing like data loss or gap in data availability to really seal the deal with the client, help you win business. But yeah, to your point, I mean, what's the alert going to say? Like the logic board is getting a little toasty in here or something. And I mean, it'd be very hard for them to like alert you to a suspected issue in advance. And so yeah, that's going to be by definition pretty unexpected. And then likely you're not going to find out that it's like offline or just not booting up until they come in, and they probably spend several hours rebooting it, trying to revive it before they bother calling you. I mean, in my experience, that can happen with clients too. You know, they'll ask us, they'll be like, what do we do? You know, if you can't get on the server, I'm like, you call us. What do you mean? What do you do? Like, you know, call us. I'm not going to give you a flow chart like, oh, you know, press this big button over here, yank this cable, plug it back in. You know, I mean, that's just asking for trouble. So, you know, most clients are going to try some things and finally call you, and then you're going to try to like figure it out. In this case, it's like, well, it's not turning on. So it's good to know that you can pop those drives in. It's not a guarantee, as you mentioned. And actually, the same client asked me that question. You know, they're like, with our Drobo, like, what happens if the Drobo dies? Can we put the drives into another Drobo? I'm like, blanket disclaimer on the Drobo. I don't know. I don't trust it. I wouldn't really rely on that in general. In theory, you should be able to migrate the data, the physical drives, into a new one, or you know, fix the hardware of the Drobo in one way or another and get that back up and running. But I did not have a good answer on the Synology. I said, I'm pretty sure that we'd be able to get you access to the data, but I certainly could not give them a guarantee like, yeah, just pop the drives in. I would always hedge that as we should be able to help you. I'm never going to say like plug and play. To your point, Sam, what would you do? Like, so if you had a second Synology there, are you saying like you'd get a similar model as part of a high availability pair, or just like having, okay, so you'd actually have it like, and I'm not totally familiar with that model, but basically like it would be in the sense of like the architectural design, like it would be replicating on an ongoing basis, or like also be able to fail over, right? Pretty much automatically.
The failover part, I'm not sure about actually, but Synology does have the sync capabilities to sync data to another one. I think they would have to have obviously separate IP addresses. So I might have to either, if we use a DNS name, we'd have to point the DNS record to that, or we just tell people to hit the new IP address and the data would be immediately available. I think, you know, there's a definite bigger cost involved. So that's for clients who are like, we absolutely can't have any downtime, you know, blah, blah, blah. So obviously a lot of clients I don't think would go for that. I just thought it would be something because of what happened to this particular one. It could be a high availability secondary Synology. And to top it all off, Hyper Backup is in a proprietary format, right? You can't just plug that into a Mac and start restoring data if your Synology fails. So if that's what you're using for a local backup, you know? Exactly.
I was going to say the same thing. That's an interesting point too. So if you, like you were saying, well, you know, it's good to have a local backup for sure. But to your exact point, if you're just using the built-in Hyper Backup to an external drive, I'm not sure what format that is. I mean, I think that it formats the drive as ext by default. You know, maybe that's the recommendation. So it's like a Linux format that you could, in theory, mount on the Mac. But the actual data stored on disk is not like it's using Carbon Copy Cloner to like clone it to the external or rsync directly for that matter. It's using some kind of proprietary format. So you would have to spin up a new Synology and connect the backup drive and then restore from backup, which also means copying 10 terabytes of data from a single spindle USB drive or something. That could take overnight or several days or something, depending, you know, before it's even on disk on the new RAID and accessible on your server, so to speak. So it's a good point. When clients say, you know, we can't afford to have this go down, you can say, okay, here's the recommended configuration and here's the cost involved. It's like double everything we've already talked about, plus extra configuration time, plus, whatever maintenance goes into keeping an eye on things, that's when they suddenly say, well, we can tolerate some downtime, and then they kind of like back it away from there. So It's actually really nice to be able to guide them to the like a true understanding of like what it would take to have that level, so that when and if something happens, they're not looking at you like, I thought you were supposed to be able to avoid any problems. It's like, well, we talked about how we could absolutely minimize any potential problems. When you saw the $10,000 price tag, you quickly ran away. So it puts the whole thing in perspective in case something does happen also.
Yeah, It's a great point. On the Synology channel in Slack, there is also discussion about having a client replicate data with an identical Synology offsite. So maybe at the owner's location or some other key person in the office has a duplicate Synology in their physical home or something like that. And then you're just replicating data across the network, either constantly or running a routine.
Exactly. That's a great solution. I've been trying to guide clients to that recently, and including in places where it's like a really great, in my mind, like a really great recommendation. Like I have a client with 2 offices in 2 different states, and the second office basically right now, in theory, they work off of the server in the first office, but the prior IT person had them using some crazy convoluted workflow where in office number 1, they were like actually moving stuff from their primary server to an FTP server that's on a different machine, using Rumpus, like the web interface to Rumpus, to basically like drop ship files to the other office, and the other office would like pick them up from there. It was just like absurd. And I'm like, so you guys like have these 2 offices, which also, by the way, like should be connected over VPN. So even if like Office 2 is accessing the files on Office 1, we're not port forwarding AFP and SMB ports, from the router. Like you're actually using a VPN to do that securely, and having this live, connection site to site. Like they're on board with all this stuff, and it's a no-brainer to stick a second Synology in the second office, like number 1, to replicate automatically, and that works on an ongoing basis. It's like a really great feature. We could give Office 2 read-only access to certain folders if you just want to like have it be that model where they can't like modify the files once they've been sent to production, so to speak. You can give them read-write access if you want to have like one folder that you drop files into that they can also modify, whatever. Not to mention all of that, it would also just be an offsite backup of your server. So if the server in Office 1 goes down for whatever reason, whether it's a catastrophic data loss or like the server, like in Sam's case, the logic board dies or whatever, in the Synology, we could just like configure those users in Office 1 to connect to the server in Office 2, and they have an up-to-date copy, like as of minutes ago, probably, of all the data, because they're already connected using VPN. So it's a great model, even if you're not using the high availability feature, just to have that second Synology like you're describing, especially in an offsite location. So, it's just amazing what you can do with the Synology. It's a really great product.
When we were talking earlier about Drobo, and I haven't seen this in a while, but tell me if you guys had seen this when you had gone to clients where some other tech company had set them up with Drobos, where they were swapping out drives and the owner or a key person was taking them home and bringing back another drive and inserting it in the Drobo. Completely using it in a non-standard practice way. In every case, I would tell them, like, this is destined for failure because you're not supposed to be doing this. This is not in the manual. They'd be hot swapping in and out like that as a backup. And I said, well, the drive you're taking home is not a backup. It's just part of the RAID. OMG, it's just like
I've seen some crazy stuff too, man. This client I'm talking about, they have a bunch of Drobos too. A different client than the first one I mentioned with the Drobo earlier. They have 3 different Drobos in one office, 2 or 3 in the other office. Like, I swear the former IT person never saw a Drobo ad online without buying one. Let's get a Drobo for your FTP server. Let's get a Drobo for Time Machine. Let's get a Drobo for your primary storage. Let's get a different Drobo for your backup. The direct attached models, the network attached models, they're all over the place. And it's just so complicated. In the second office, our server's down now too. They're like freaking out. And I called him, and guy who's in charge of that office, suddenly it showed no free space on the Drobo. And I know there's supposed to be 10 terabytes available. And, and this is the classic thing about the Drobo, where you just never really know how much space you have, And so we're coming in cold, like we have no idea what's going on. He's describing that, like, Suddenly there was no space available, but I can't account for where that space is. I can only find 1 terabyte of data. So then I see that there's a red light. So I pulled that drive out. I put another one in, and then there's an empty slot. So I stuck a drive in there too. I'm like, oh man. I'm like, can you see the Drobo still? Okay, good. Just don't touch anything. This was like the 4th of July weekend. I'm like, I'll talk to you like after the holiday. We're just going to let the Drobo sit there for a while. I'm not getting involved at this point. I have no idea how you've been trained to deal with these issues, but this is not up to spec.
As we do, guys, I was texting you the other day when we're in sticky situations or frustrating situations, because we're all there for each other, which I'm thankful for. And I had a recent day like that where I was reaching out to you guys with a real rough one that was plaguing me for almost an entire workday. Basic premise is we had gotten a call from someone who was consulting with someone in Bridgewater, Connecticut, which I found out was like an hour from me, so I probably shouldn't have taken it in the first place. He was from the city, and this client lives in the city, but he has a house out in Bridgewater, and he wasn't going to consult with him all the way out in Connecticut because the consultant was based in Manhattan. So he found us on the ACN, and he called me up and we talked, and that's how we got this client. So basically they have a very large home that they only use in the summer months, which is we should all be so lucky, I guess. But they have a whole bunch of Ubiquiti Unify equipment, and they have Sonos throughout the house, which I don't have a lot of experience dealing with the technical end of Sonos. There's usually an AV person or AV team that does that in conjunction with my work. But I said, okay, I feel comfortable taking on this job, I think, because it's all Unify equipment, which I'm totally comfortable with. And there is an AV company that's available for the Sonos stuff. The reason why they called me is because their network was slowly failing or going offline a lot, and their music was having trouble. And I said, it's a little dangerous to walk into something like that without any knowledge, but why not? I took the gig. I went over there. I met with the caretaker of the home, who said, right now we're completely down. We don't know why. And when I went and checked it, I was pretty solid setup. There was a modem, a USG Ubiquiti gateway, and a 48-port Unify switch. I could tell right away the switch was flashing repeatedly. So there was some kind of network collisions happening or a loop back, or I haven't determined that yet. So within the first half hour, I was able to quickly determine there was one particular Ethernet connection that was causing the failure. Basically, I just systematically unplugged one by one. That's all I did because I didn't know anything about where anything went. And I finally found one. Once I unplugged it, the flashing ceased. Everything was able to get online. Everything was working exactly as it should. So I said, well, this would be great if it was just some random piece of equipment and I'd be done for the day. So I asked the caretaker to come back, and I was like, well, this is labeled. Where does this go? Do you know? And he goes, yeah, that goes to the upstairs Sonos rack. So I was like, oh, okay. And I go up there, and there was 5-port pack edge switch, PoE switch, that was connected there. And then there were 2 Connect amps and then 7 Connects. They were all Ethernet daisy chained off of each other. A lot of equipment and handling a lot of zones. I started to try and figure out what in this rack was causing the problem. So I started by eliminating the switch. That wasn't it. I went to 1 Connect amp. That still caused the failure. I did a million different things, guys. I tried one of the Connects without daisy chaining anything. That would still cause failures. Anything you could think of. Different port on the switch. And I think you guys even chimed in with a couple of things. I was like, I tried that. I'm like freaking out, because those days when you're like, I did everything I possibly could, and I have no idea why this is happening. Top it all off, I'm not a Sonos expert. So I was doing some research, and Jerry, you had experience with this too. Spanning tree settings on the Unify equipment have caused issues with Sonos, right?
That's right. Yeah. In the old home, we had Sonos equipment, newer Sonos equipment, not as sophisticated as what you're talking about, or not as elaborate a setup. And I couldn't get it to play nice with the Ubiquiti equipment. And I went on Reddit, and I was chastised by people saying, oh, well, we have, there's no problem with Sonos and Ubiquiti. And I'm like, okay. Thank you. And I think that was the time I switched over to Eero. There you go.
I saw a lot of blog posts about that, how Unify and Sonos don't play nice together. And I was like, oh, man. So, I found a couple of articles that talked about changing RSTP to STP for spanning trees. So I made changes there according to the article. no go there. I even said, okay, maybe it's the way it's communicating with this switch. So there was another 8-port switch that I grabbed and I plugged that in. For a moment, I said, oh, everything's staying online here. Everything's starting to work. I was thinking maybe there's just some kind of communication here. But what happened when I did that, this is the weirdest thing, is I told the caretaker, I'm like, hey, take out the Sonos app, see what you see. He could see that equipment that was on that rack, but all the other Sonos equipment throughout the house disappeared from the app. So now he's like, well, I lost the other 2 zones now. And I'm like, well, crap. I can't get this right. And I didn't even tell you, on top of this all, the reason why tech had called me in and I went in a pinch was this gentleman is the head of a large company and he had a bunch of his employees over for a gathering. So they were all like outside, like in the pool area, inside doing things. And when network goes down, they were actually kind of still working at times. I could only diagnose things briefly. And then someone's like, I got a video conference call. You can't disconnect me. And I'm like, this is hell on wheels.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it was like a really rough day in terms of that stuff. I'm like, what did I get myself into?
And how long were you there?
So at this point, let's see, I got there at 9 a.m. Like I said, I diagnosed the problem by 9:30. But then here we're along the lines of like 3:30, 4 o'clock, and I'm still there.
Yeah.
And, that's.
And Sam, you're probably feeling like, but at this point, you could have hired a 10-piece band just to play all the music live, rather than stream it over Sonos. Like, just like work around the problem entirely.
I know. This was just a nightmare. And then I called the AV company, who it turns out we've worked with. And I told the guy everything. And he's just like, huh. And I'm like, yeah, I know. Like, he just had no good answers because I told him all the things I tried.
Right. So over the phone, he had no idea what was going on.
No idea whatsoever. Yeah. And as a smart dude, he was just like, I don't know. You tried everything. I'm like, I agree. I even updated firmware. I did all this stuff. So anyway.
Sam, what started what had you just installed the Ubiquiti stuff recently, or had somebody put in Sonos recently? Like what like prompted all of this incompatibility between seeming like, a Ubiquiti and Sonos that are already installed?
It's a good question. It's what we had all asked, and the caretaker insisted nothing had changed. Like no new equipment came in, no new lines were run. I was thinking maybe maybe Sonos auto updated, and that caused an issue. Right. That was the only thing I can think of there, because the Ubiquiti equipment had not been updated. I did that as part of my visit. I updated the firmware on most of the devices, so we couldn't figure out what started it. But the only thing that they did say was, they used to daisy chain all Sonos equipment via Ethernet all the way through, and now they just plug in one and have the others go over Wi-Fi. So he goes, maybe we'll go back in there and we'll do that. We haven't done that setup in 2 years, so I'm not sure why it just happened all of a sudden. So literally at the very beginning of our show, I actually emailed the caretaker, to say, hey, I didn't hear from you. I heard the AV company was going yesterday. What happened? Because I wanted to have an answer mid-show. And he did reply quickly. He didn't know exactly what they did, but they did the recommendation that we were talking about, which was they hardwired just the one Connect amp and then wirelessly connected the rest of them instead of daisy chaining all of them via Ethernet. And they reset them back to factory defaults. And that seems to have resolved the issue, and now everything's functioning as normal again.
Wow. Well, you can send the band home. You can tell them they've played a good set, and you're good now. That's amazing, man. My knowledge of Sonos is a little bit limited. Idea of connecting all the additional, speakers and amps and things wirelessly, is that using proprietary Sonos wireless system, or is that connected and like joining the wireless, like the Wi-Fi of the home in some way?
I think you're right on the first point, although I would be stepping a little bit out of turn to pretend like I know. But I think you're right in that they join each other through their proprietary system.
Actually, those were the older Sonos controllers would all set up their own little mesh before anybody knew what mesh was. Sonos had its own little mesh network. But the newer Sonos products join your Wi-Fi. And I have noticed, and again, this only really applies to newer products, is, they're always updating the firmware and they'll push it out from the app on the iPhone or the iOS device. And when they do that, sometimes there are cases where, for whatever reason, the particular piece of hardware doesn't recover, and you need to kind of set it back to factory default, which isn't a big deal, and just have it rejoin the network. So you give it a name like whatever, like family room, if it's an individual speaker set or whatever, and you proceed that way. But, when you're dealing with those older Sonos bridge devices and the amps like you're talking about, it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
It's far more complicated, actually.
I'll tell you something else that made this, a very stressful day, besides not even eating or anything like that. Besides having to like dance around people that needed to be online, I was in the closet area disconnecting Sonos devices. I had actually called Sonos support as well. And I was replugging them in and trying all this stuff. And the caretaker comes running in and he goes, "There's a really weird noise coming out of the kitchen speakers, man. You got to check it out." So I go over there and it sounds like ba 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 ba, and it's just blasting through the speakers in the kitchen. And I'm like, "Oh my God." I'm like, I don't know what to do. So I go running back over to the Sonos and I find the one that's labeled kitchen. I just pull the power. "Is it gone?" He's like, "It's gone." I'm like, "I'm not plugging that crap back in right now. We got bigger fish to fry. You can do without music in the kitchen if this gets resolved, One thing after another, and, they have guests there and all this other stuff. It was a really tough day. I mean, the only saving grace is I am, in fact, billing, and we billed at our highest rate possible because we don't have a relationship with them. It's just our normal hourly. I'll probably shave some time because the resolution came after I left, but I'm definitely billing for my time.
Sounds like you were stuck in one of Dante's rings of hell.
It felt like it, man.
Command, control, power. Jerry does his voices of customers of all kinds.
Am I on the cloud?
Joe spins his deeply detailed yarns all the time.
I have a whole story about this.
Sam is on the road again, phoning in from a hotel.
At least we know where I am.
Half a century combined of Apple expertise right now. My Mac is slow. Have you tried restarting? Well, the fans won't blow. Have you tried restarting? But my data is gone. Have you tried restarting? I dropped it in the pond. Have you tried restarting? Well, my coffee is cold. Have you tried restarting? Well, I'm getting old. Have you tried restarting? I fell off a horse. Have you tried restarting? I'm getting a divorce. Have you tried restarting? Command, control, power. Command, control, power.
All right, because Sam was breaking up a little bit. Jerry, are you getting that, or is that just
No,
me? Because Ashley's still driving around town.
No,
I don't know why.
He was
Ash,
good.
can we park somewhere?
Yeah, we
okay,
were
so I'm
hearing
getting-
some major potholes, I think, at one point.
Yeah, there's definitely some potholes going on. Yeah, I'm hoping we can we're in town and we're just driving around in circles as we're talking. Okay, we're about to park.
Sounds
okay,
like Ashley
so-
dropped the tranny.
No, no, I don't think so.
There's no
All right.
Avoid the damn
Let's hope
holes, will you?
There's no pieces of your motorhome in this road about 2 miles back.
Yeah, it could be. We got to circle back around and check. Oh man.
Yeah, I think, it would probably have to have a separate IP address, and then we just
I'm
help point
recording.
Oh my god.
people. Jerry, did you not mute yourself? Oh, that was awesome.
Man.
Wait
That
a
was
minute.
great.
Wait a minute. Because I did switch off the mic. That's so weird. Hold on one second. No, ATR USB mic. All
telling the
right,
story
let's
one.
try it again. All right, the mic's off. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.